Sounds good. I'm pulling up the intro slide now. Let me know once or let me know when to go because I don't know or who's in and who's not.
Let's just go for it. We've got a lot of
Okay.
attendees in here. Yeah.
Are people in?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So I'm the ominous voice. I'm still here. I'm going to reintroduce Michelle, who has been teaching for 29 years. So again, thank you for your service teaching social studies. She's also teaching or teaching in the same school system as two of her sons. And the third son has just recently started college. He's a college freshman. So we are going to allow Michelle to get right back in where she left off. Thank you all for your grace and your patience. And we look forward to a great lecture series and doing the work of what is going to make a difference and not let anybody turn us around. So, Michelle, take away.
Okay, guys, can we go to the slide that is about voting for people that have been convicted of a felony? Keep going. Keep going. Yep. One more, I think. There we go. Okay. So one of the things that I found shocking was the difficulty that states make voting for someone that has a past conviction. Maryland, where I'm from, is not one of those states, but it's hard to see, I know, the key, but there are a number of states, and of course you can see where many of those states are, that take voting rights away. It is 4.7 million Americans that are working and tax paying, because this is not referring to anybody that is still in prison. This is people that have been out. They are either on parole or their parole is up. And a number of states do have a way in which they can get that right to vote back, but they make it very difficult. Can you go to the next slide? I'm not sure if someone's asking a question, but this is voting rights that can be restored, but notice it's based on the type of conviction. It is based on the fact that they have to petition or apply to the state. And of course, that is a difficult process. And obviously, we know that some states make that more difficult than others. Interestingly, I just taught voting rights, voting registration with my students, and I was explaining this. And one of my students raised their hand and said, isn't the whole idea behind prison that they're supposed to be reformed, that they come back out and be a productive part of our community? And I just found it fascinating that the kids can see that, and yet we don't, and many states don't. So that was just one of my topics. And again, these are just a brief look at several things. So can we go on to the next one? So this is another one. I actually learned about this one from a podcast, and the podcast is called A Blind Plea, and had no idea actually what it was referring to. This is the woman that the podcast is about. Her name is Devin Gray. She's from the North, but she ended up living in Alabama. And she was in an extremely abusive relationship, and she ended up killing her partner. Now, she completely admits that she killed the partner. As a matter of fact, she is the one that called the police. But typically, when we think of a plea bargain, we think of a situation where someone pleads guilty to a lesser crime and they serve less time. Well, in the state of Alabama, good old Alabama. I feel like it always comes back to Alabama for us with the Institute for Common Power. They have something called a blind plea, which, yes, in fact, you do plead guilty, but you don't know the time that you are going to serve. So I had no idea about a blind plea. And like I said, I teach American government. So I went into my school and I asked all the other government teachers, and none of them had heard of a blind plea. Well, Devin was given the maximum sentence that was allowed. So in fact, the idea that she did not have a jury trial did not save her in any way. I would also like to point out that she was a person of color that killed a white male in Alabama. She was horrendously beaten and basically held captive. As a matter of fact, she didn't even know the address when she called to say that she had killed her partner, where he kept her. But the fact is that it didn't matter that she had been beaten. They did not believe at the moment that she was in imminent danger. So that takes me to the next topic. And when you do that, it's just going to slide in what I just said. Typically, we think of someone that pleads guilty with the expectation of a lesser sentence, but not in Alabama. It is an unknown sentence. There are very few states. I tried to research this, very few states that have that. But her story takes me to the next issue in our criminal justice system, and that is also connected to my background in teaching AP Psych. So for quite a while, we know that there's something called battered women syndrome. It is now called intimate partner violence. But there are a number of studies about women of color, particularly Black women, and there are significant barriers that they face when dealing with domestic violence. And so I put there about dual arrest. And that means that when typically a Black woman calls the police and says that there is domestic violence taking place in the home, that both of them end up being arrested. And so the idea that, you can just get away is actually not something. They are just as likely to be arrested themselves. And not only that, just a brief note down there about women of color face nearly twice the incarceration rate. So even if Devin had, which her lawyer did not, encourage her to use the intimate partner violence, the likelihood of it working for her is not very great, unfortunately. Okay, so moving on. So I am just fascinated by what is happening to parole in Alabama, not fascinated in a good way. If you look at the bottom, I start with 2017, the parole board granted about 54% of paroles. And in 2023, it was only 8%. Okay, so maybe they have gotten tough on crime, but when you look at the real statistics, that is not what is happening. What is happening is people that are working, they are leaving prison for 8 hours a day and working in the community. And yet when they come up for parole, they are not getting parole. In the United States, there really is no oversight about the parole board. There's a whole situation that is happening. This is just in the state of Alabama, but if you could go to the next slide, it is not the only state that is going this way. And there are some headlines. Both of those are headlines that I found. Again, we know it is Black men, but I mean, parole in general has gone down. There is a federal lawsuit that is dealing with the denials for work release inmates, because the question is, if they can go out and work for 8 hours a day, why should they not get parole? Well, Louisiana this past year, and their General Assembly is trying to do the same thing, where parole would actually be abolished, and that anyone that committed a crime after August 1st, 2024 would not be eligible for parole at all, only juveniles. So a little bit of history here. Is this convict leasing continued? I absolutely think it is. We know that, and I know that's very small, but you know, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery except as, you know, a punishment for crime, and that is exactly what they did. They punished African Americans in the South for every crime to get them in jail, and then they leased them as labor. And so, in fact, we are back to what is happening. That is the same situation, in that we have people that are being leased. They are working each day and they cannot get parole. So, okay, that was another one of my quick topics. Can we go on? I'm just going to try to hit these really quick. I know we're way over time. And here's my really sort of last love. And that is the idea of what is happening for people in our country that are mentally ill. Prisons have actually become the new asylums. This is a huge social issue. It's difficult to get people even help for their mental illness, but it doesn't matter if you're looking at state, federal, or local jails. Approximately half of all of the people that are in our prison system, jails, whatever level, are people that are dealing with some sort of mental illness. And my last thing, I think there's one more, well, two more, but it just talks about the number of people that are mentally ill that are living in our prison systems. And if we do one more, it looks at some of the states. You click one more. So Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama, those three states, people that have mental health issues, they are the least likely to get access to care if they are mentally ill, except they have the highest rate of incarceration. And then I had one more slide, and this was just if I had time, which obviously we're a mess about. But I found this really interesting article, and it was out of Vermont, which actually has a really low rate of incarceration. But there is a correctional facility in Vermont for women, and there are 100 women in that, and half of them are still awaiting trial. But they want to build a new prison system, prison correctional facility for them, to the tune of $70 million. And so my thought was really, can you imagine how useful that money would be in helping those women in a completely different way? Some of those women are dealing with mental health issues, but almost 90% of those women at some point had dealt with abuse. And so I know I breezed through that really quick, but those were my topics. My hope is that you just think about any of those issues. Maybe look up a little bit more about those issues. Maybe it's something that you didn't know already, and it just raises your awareness about some of the things that are happening in our criminal justice system, racial and social injustices. Does anybody have a question, comment?
Thank you so much. You're a trooper.
Thank you.
So as our next presenter gets ready, I will be introducing, I'm so lucky I get to introduce this person, Kimu Boynton. So yeah, you can set up your slides as I just set you up. Kimu Boynton serves as the Interim Assistant Dean in the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences, and as an Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Delaware State University. His teaching philosophy focuses on the importance of experiential and practical learning. His research interests include violence prevention, trauma recognition and response in minority communities, and law enforcement relations. He also serves as the director of the Law Studies program and works to assist students in navigating the law school admissions process. He received his BA in political science from Delaware State University and his JD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Kimu Boynton, everybody.
Thank you, Carmen. I just got a message. I think I need permission to share. All right, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna hopefully share this. Uh-oh. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. It's okay, there we go. All right, is everyone able to see the slideshow?
Yes, we see you.
All right, excellent. So I am presenting today on Bob Moses and the Algebra Project, and just going to talk briefly about Moses's civil rights work and his work in education as a sort of second wind in his life. And so what I want to do today is just examine his early life and his education, talk about his civil rights activism, review sort of his legacy as it relates to civil rights and his anti-war stance during the Vietnam War, and then explore basically the link between his civil rights activities and his latter work with mathematics competency and literacy with children of color and poor and marginalized children. All right, so Moses is born in New York City in 1935, and he grew up in Harlem in public housing, but his parents were committed to his education, and part of his early life involved frequent trips to the library. He eventually was accepted into one of New York's prestigious public high schools, Stuyvesant High School, and excelled in his education while he was in high school, eventually earning a scholarship to Hamilton College, and he eventually became a Rhodes Scholar. And so early on in his life, his parents saw that education was a key to him changing the trajectory of his future. While after leaving Hamilton College and teaching for a time, he also received his master's degree in philosophy from Harvard, and started to work on his coursework for his doctoral degree when he became involved in the civil rights movement. So as a young teacher working at Horace Mann School in New York, he started to increasingly hear about what was happening in the South as it related to not just Jim Crow and anti-voter registration efforts. And he decided in 1959 he was going to get involved. And his first sort of entree into that world was the Youth March for Integrated Schools in Washington, D.C., where he worked alongside Bayard Rustin. And although he initially said he was willing to help by stuffing envelopes and doing light office work for groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, and the Council of Federated Organizations, he kind of felt that, you know, there should be something more that he's doing other than just doing office work. And Rustin saw in him some leadership qualities that sort of helped Rustin to recognize that Moses himself could offer something more. And so he encouraged Moses to travel to Atlanta and start working with Martin Luther King with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and to get more involved in what was happening in the South. And so Moses goes to the South and he travels on behalf of SNCC and sort of has this dual role also with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he starts sort of going on a sort of a tour of the South, realizing what was happening in Mississippi and other places, initially just as a volunteer during his summers off from school. But he starts to get more and more involved. And after some time, it becomes pretty evident to the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC and COFO that this particular person, although unlike some of the other leaders in the movement who were very charismatic and maybe wanted the spotlight, that Bob Moses was able to organize from a grassroots standpoint. And so I have a quote here. It says, "Leadership is there in the people. You don't have to worry about where your leaders are, how we're going to get to some leaders. The leadership is there. If you go out and you work with your people, then the leadership will emerge." And so that sort of becomes his sort of the thing that he lives by. And you'll see it as a theme in his life, that it's not so much Bob Moses looking for the spotlight. It's Bob Moses recognizing that in the communities that you serve, there are people that can emerge as leaders. So in 1964, he comes up with this, or prior to 1964, but it comes to fruition in 1964. Moses kind of conceives this notion of a freedom summer where he would, along with others, recruit students from northern and western schools to go into the South, specifically Mississippi, to assist with voter registration. And so the students would get some training, and then they would then travel to the South in the summer of 1964. And what he wanted to avoid was, as he called them, the John Brown types. He didn't want any white students who felt that it was their job to go down and be saviors for Blacks in Mississippi. He wanted folks that were committed to the cause out of the goodness of their hearts, not because they had some type of savior mentality. And that also goes back to the theme that this power should come from within the people, not from without. And so he organizes in Mississippi for one specific reason. In 1962, there were only 6.7% of African Americans in Mississippi that were registered to vote, which was abysmal. Mississippi was sort of the extreme in the American landscape as it related to African American voter registration, as it related to violence against African Americans. And I just put some stats on this particular slide. And just so we know, when we say Freedom Summer, he organized freedom schools. There were freedom libraries, and perhaps the most important were the freedom houses, where local individuals opened up their homes to these college students and sometimes faced backlash. And so there were over 1,000 people arrested during Freedom Summer. We know the story of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, who were killed along with one other civil rights activist during Freedom Summer. And although we don't have a statistic, we know that there were 3 documented murders of African Americans in Mississippi, but that number could be higher depending on what type of activism they were involved in. In addition, 37 churches were bombed, and countless other acts of violence were committed against Blacks. During that time, Moses also helps to assist in the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And this, one of my heroes, Fannie Lou Hamer, was integral with working with Bob Moses in the development of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They challenged the white power structure of the Democratic Party in Mississippi. They had a mock election, but most importantly, they asked to be seated at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. in Atlantic City, and they were refused. And so once they were excluded, there began this negotiation between the vice presidential candidate at the time, and there was this idea like, well, we'll just give them 2 seats at the table. And while some individuals who were involved in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party thought that that was okay, Moses and Hamer and others felt that that was completely a sort of a slap in the face. And so they refused. In this particular picture, you see Fannie Lou Hamer, you see Ella Baker, Stokely Carmichael, Emory Harris, Sam Block, but you also see Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is the non-voting member of Congress from the District of Columbia as a young student activist. So the legacy of Moses's work during Freedom Summer brought attention to what was happening in Mississippi, especially with the murders of Schorner, Cheney, and Goodman, but also with the fact that the voting age members of the African American population in Mississippi, their rates were abysmally low. And so, of course, this lets the nation know that what's happening in Mississippi cannot be tolerated. It also led to the eventual pass of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it looks like I have went back. I had a mistake on that slide. But his grassroots effort also led to the legacy of other movements throughout the nation's history from a grassroots point of view. And Moses was committed to having movements start with the people on the ground, not sort of a top-down movement, but a bottom-up movement. We'll see this later on when I discuss the Algebra Project. So eventually, Moses resigns from Congress of Federated Organizations, and he starts to speak out against the Vietnam War. That causes some indigestion with other members of SNCC who just felt that, you know, their goal was voter registration and desegregation. They didn't really feel that members of SNCC should be speaking out against the war. That was not sort of their fight. But Bob Moses, having been a philosophy major and having 2 degrees and plus starting his doctoral work in philosophy, felt that this war itself was problematic for the country because you had African American soldiers who were fighting overseas, theoretically, to advance American imperialism, but yet at home, they don't have the right to vote in places like Mississippi. So this kind of alienates Moses, and he starts to distance himself from SNCC. Eventually, he is called up for the draft. He moves to Canada, then eventually moves to Tanzania in order to avoid having to serve in the Vietnam War. So he was essentially a conscientious objector. Some people use the term draft dodger. I think the more pertinent term is draft resistor, because he was committed to the philosophy that he was not going to serve in this nation's army as it had gotten itself involved in imperialistic wars. So his anti-war stance essentially isolated him. But because he would go on to Tanzania, he would teach math, and his wife would teach English, and so he kind of develops this teaching style that would eventually become the Algebra Project. In this slide, I quote him saying, "Education is still basically Jim Crow as far as the kids who are in the bottom economic strata of the country. No one knows about them. No one cares about them." And so we see sort of a direct correlation to what was happening in Mississippi. You had large swaths of the Mississippi population who were poor, who were Black, who were sharecroppers or poor workers, and no one cared about them. No one knew about them, but for Bob Moses's work and the work of countless other civil rights activists. And so now he's moving this same needle forward as it relates to education in this country. And his vision for education equality involved teaching poor children, impoverished children, math literacy. He saw that as a way to improve their lot. And so he returns to the United States in the 1970s after former President Jimmy Carter um, gives amnesty to anyone who is a draft resistor, and he continues his doctoral work at Harvard. While doing his doctoral work, he's awarded a MacArthur Genius Award as he comes up with this concept of the algebra project. Another quote pulled: everyone said sharecroppers didn't want to vote. It wasn't until we got them demanding to vote that we got attention. Today, when kids are falling wholesale through the cracks, people say they don't want to learn. We have to get the kids themselves to demand what everybody says they don't want. So essentially, we see another direct comparison to what was happening, or I'm sorry, direct correlation between what he was doing in Mississippi in the 1960s and what he sees as important work in the 1980s and 90s with poor children. That if you say a kid doesn't want to do math, doesn't want to do algebra, what you're essentially doing is assigning them to basically an impoverished life or a role where they're not going to be prepared for college, therefore they won't go on to higher education, and then they'll be classified into some low echelon of employment or unskilled labor. So what Moses wants to do is figure out, how do we improve mathematics education to serve these underserved communities? And he saw algebra as a tool for empowerment. If you could increase the test scores and increase college preparedness, then you could help poor and impoverished kids who everybody had written off and forgotten about, help them move up the ladder of life and success. So what was his approach? It involved professional development for teachers. It involved going into schools and looking at what environments look like. He focused on real world applications and critical thinking. And he also involved the community, parents, community leaders, coaches, staff. And most importantly, he got the kids to believe in themselves. In his book, Radical Equations, he talks about the fact that if you want a child to learn, you have to give them something to believe in themselves. And so he says in the 1960s, it wasn't radical to do voter registration per se. What was radical was to mount an insurgency to ensure that Black sharecroppers in the Delta voted. In the morning dawn of the 21st century, it isn't radical to do algebra per se. What is radical is to mount insurgencies to ensure that students at the bottom get the literacies they need. And this is what he believed in. This is the approach, right? Use real world applications. And I will say, full disclosure, the idea to work on this particular presentation about Bob Moses and the Algebra Project was given to me by Merrill Holloway, one of our other educators, said this would be a great piece. And as I was going through some of the literature, what it made me realize is that this was a way that I believe would have been beneficial if I were taught algebra using experiential learning techniques, using real world applications. And it reminded me of sort of the school without walls concept that started in Philadelphia. All right, what's the methodology? He had the Young People's Project, where he used young people to teach other young people, sort of train the trainer. He believed that you got to get children out of the classroom, take them on trips, show them how math and algebra relates to sites around a city, subway stops, historical markers. How do we get from A to B using math, using algebra? These are sort of the real world ways students can conceptualize learning objectives without just looking at a book and looking at formulas all day in a classroom. He believed that students had to be able to see things in the real world in order to conceptualize them. And he quotes, and another quote I have from him, he says, "People will not follow other people's agendas. Goals have to be internalized." He meant by that, what he meant by that was that students are not just going to follow you because you say they have to learn it. You have to show them how it benefits them. So some achievements and some impacts. There were success stories, both tested by other scholars. There's literature that shows that his method vastly improved math and science literacies. He served over 40,000 plus students across several states, many in the South. And one of the biggest success stories was the Hart School in Bessemer, Alabama, where a poor, impoverished school in less than 3 years was able to outpace a well-funded middle-class school in the same area. He also went on to assist with the calculus project and the idea of democratizing advanced mathematics. And so why this topic? I believe that educators should face inequality head on. We have the power to sort of empower our students, and we can do it in ways that are feasible and radical, just like Moses. And so we need to continue on the tradition of Freedom Summer and involve the students in their own success, just like Moses involved poor Mississippi farmers and non-registered voters in their own success. So Moses passed away in 2021, but his call to action still rings true. We as educators, we have to continue to work for social justice, and we have to find innovative ways to teach and empower our students. I do have some literature that I reviewed here, which I can share with anybody that wants it. Any questions? That's Moses at Freedom Summer, by the way.
Camille, this is Luke. That was phenomenal, first of all. It's always just an honor to be in space with you and to learn from you. I think the message about involving students in their own learning is a really powerful one. I know there are a lot of educators on the call tonight, and this is led by Institute Educator Ambassadors. And so for all of us to just be reminded of that from your perspective is critical. And that we're also, we have a role actively just outside of the four walls of our classroom too. And I think what you've shared with us about Mr. Moses and the way that he approached that, and obviously the way you're approaching it as an educator too, that's really valuable. So centering our students, thinking about ourselves as more than just confined to the walls of our classrooms as educators, and then also bringing that justice work into those spaces. Like all of that is, that's what I'm hearing in that story that you've shared, and it's a powerful one. So really appreciate you being with us tonight. That was excellent. For the sake of time, since we had the big disruptions earlier, we're going to make our transition over to Michelle early. But again, Mr. Boyne, thank you so much. Much appreciated. With that, I want to draw our attention over to Michelle Early, who's another Institute Educator Ambassador who's joining us this evening. Michelle is going to talk to us tonight about, sorry, I'm pulling up my notes right now, Black mental health and the classroom. Michelle's the business teacher at Walkersville High School in Frederick County, Maryland. She serves as her school's equity representative, working to ensure equitable education and workspace for her entire community. Additionally, Michelle has served as a proud member of the board of directors of Frederick County Teachers Association. Thank you for your work with the union, Michelle, since July of 23, and thoroughly enjoys working with and for the over 3,300 teachers within FCPS. As a career changer, Michelle's firsthand experience working with the sectors that she teaches her students about on a daily basis. And her sharing her screen made my notes about her biography go away. Hey, that's just the way the night's going. I think we know enough to get things started though, so I'm just going to hand it over to Michelle so she can get going with her presentation. Thanks for being with us tonight, Michelle. They're all yours. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Luke. I apologize. It's been so long since I've used Zoom, so bear with me. Can you all see my screen? Yeah,
it looks great.
Okay, so one thing I will say about me is that I definitely believe in God, and I believe that things happen for a reason. Not everything that's happened before, but just overall the content of what we're all talking about tonight. Thus far, I feel like both Michelle and Camille, what they have spoken about lead to what I am speaking about tonight, and I thank you all for joining us. So today we're going to talk about Black mental health in the classroom, and we've already talked about the classroom. We've also talked about mental health in the capacity, so this all fits together perfectly. Let's go. Oh, hopefully, let's go. All right, so today we're going to be this is just an overview of what we'll take a look at. All right. Consarian Ngara. This is a phrase that is uttered upon greeting people in the Maasai tribe, which is in Northern Africa in Kenya. It translates to mean, "and how are the children?" I became familiar with this phrase and this tribe earlier last year, I believe, as our superintendent, Dr. Cheryl Dyson, presented this to us as a way for us to be able to present ourselves to our students every single day. The tribe, the Maasai tribe, they asked this question because this is how they know how their society is performing. If the children are doing well, then their society is doing well, which means that they are making progress. Everything is going as it should be. However, if their children are not doing well, then the society is not doing well, which caused me to think that children there are they are the thermometer. They're the thermostat. They set the temperature for how things are going. They don't just react and respond. How they are is how everything should be going. With that, I wanted to envision what would we look like as a society if we did the same thing, if we truly valued our children and allowed them to be the thermostat for our situation and for everything that we do in life. In considering that, I had to address some problems that exist. Number one, we have inequitable access to many things across the country. We have inequitable access to mental health services that are provided to every single person, but especially our children. We have inequitable access to books that match our identity. So we have book bans. I think we all heard about that earlier. We have book bans that occur, and with the book bans occurring, that's removing some of the books that some of our children need access to so that they can see themselves on pages before them. We also have inequitable access to counselors of color. Respectfully speaking, one of the questions that I asked earlier this year in my capacity as a member of the Racial Equity Committee of Frederick County was how many counselors in the entire district do we have that are of color? The answer came back that out of the 70 schools that we have less than 10 that are of color, counselors that are of color. An additional problem that we have is that there is no mirror that exists for the majority of our students. Right now, our district sits at 50.1% students of color and 49.9% white students. And with that, we do not have that many teachers of color within our district. Right now, across the United States, Black people represent 13.6% of the population, yet as educators, we only represent 6.1%. With the majority of Black Americans coming from 10 states, which are all located along the East Coast range and then down to Louisiana. We need representation. Our students need representation. They need to be able to see themselves. One of the amazing books that I had an opportunity to read this summer or in recent months was Why Are All of the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. And one of the quotes that stood out to me is before you on the screen. And I'll give you a moment to go ahead and read through that quote. What stands out to me the most is that our Black students are sitting together, they're doing things, they are merely existing in schools, and they are unable to tap into many of the other services that are available to students who do not look like them, starting all the way down to and beginning with the racial wealth gap that exists. As some may try to deny it, this is true, So this book was originally written in 2006, 2007. I'm sorry, 1996, 1997. And Dr. Daniel Tatum did republish the book around 2016 to include more statistical facts and to get more of history incorporated within it. And while I love the quote that she gave and the statistics that she provided from Pew Research, they were from 2016. So I wanted to be able to pull more relevant facts to see what households are looking like today. If you take a look at the chart in front of you, which came from Pew Research, it's showing data from 2021 and 2019 as we look at the median wealth of US households in 2021 by race and ethnicity. We can take a look and see that white and Asian households are leading the wealth of households across the country. Behind them, significantly behind them, are Hispanic households. And then we see that Black households are at the bottom of that totem pole, which means that if our Black families, by and large, are not able to tap into the wealth that is available in the United States, then how can they be expected to tap into all of the resources that are also available for other people in the United States? Do they know about the services that are offered in their school and otherwise available to them? This was something that became very apparent to me today. One of the other roles that I'm blessed to serve in is that of a tutor for our Scholars in Motion program here in Frederick County. And I learned today, as if I didn't already know, just how big the wealth gap is right here in the town where I live. To have this be one of the richest counties in our state, and also the fastest growing district in the entire state, but yet we still have so many families who lack basic cares, basic needs. How are they supposed to thrive? How can a student go to school and focus on education when this is the reality that they come home to at night? So with that, I wanted to dig deeper. I wanted to find out from people that were around me what their educational experience was like. Now, I will admit this survey is a little low on participants and respondents. As such, this is something that I would love to delve deeper into in the future. But I did administer a survey that yielded 41 recipients ranging from ages 13 to 74. And 12% of those who responded believed that their culture was taught to them when they were in school. 12% of 41 people believed that in some capacity, their culture was taught in school. Now, I should add that the racial makeup of those 41 respondents did include 2 people who were white, while everyone else identified as some person of color, whether it be Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native, Hawaiian, or other. But with that, again, only 12% believed that their culture was taught. Many believed that they felt left out in that representation of their school and that something else should have been offered to them. I was also able to pull 3 other interesting facts from that survey. Interesting fact number 1, 87% of respondents were Black, there we go, and 43% of respondents attended schools that were mostly white. So we have the majority of the respondents being Black, but yet less than the majority were able to attend, but less than the majority attended schools that were representative of people of their color. Interesting fact number 2, some of the respondents were involved in desegregation at their schools in their neighborhood. And this was something that I found interesting, to be able to read through the perspective of the mental health that some people were experiencing as they went to school throughout the desegregation period. The third interesting fact that popped out to me was that 4% of respondents did not feel seen or valued by their peers, and 9.8% did not feel seen or valued by staff. In today's culture, we're so used to seeing people or students who relate to their peers by the things that they're able to say and do on social media. And it seems like everyone has some kind of clique or group that they belong to. So it stood out to me that there were people who said that they did not feel seen within their school buildings. Now, whether those were the same people who said that they did not feel seen by the adults in their building, I'm not sure because of the anonymity of the survey, but that is also something that I would like to explore more. So here are some suggestions. So again, I posed the question, how can we go forward? What changes can we make so that our students are not feeling unseen in their classrooms, so that their voices are heard, so that they can continue to improve? Because statistically, we see that that a whopping majority of Black students who do receive mental health services get those services from school, whether they knew that it existed and that's the only place where they're able to get it, or it was eventually passed to them and that's still how they're able to get mental health services. The majority of them are receiving those services in school. In school, it is something that is free, it's something that's offered to them, whereas outside of the school, it's something that comes along with the stigma or something that also comes along with a cost that they may not be able to afford. The first suggestion that I got when I asked the question, what should we do going forward to be able to help our students in the classroom? It was said that we should present history and as many perspectives as possible for the people who lived during the time studied. I think this is simply put that we need to be able to present all history, because all history is American history. It's not just respectfully, the whitewashed history that we've seen is the only American history. No, my Black and Jamaican history is American history. And someone's Native history is American history. And these are all the things that we need to present. Continue offering opportunities for students to learn about our culture and create a safe space for them to ask questions, share what's culturally important to them with others. We can see this happening when we create spaces for clubs that represent identities that we often kind of mush together with other similar people. This is something that we need to do so that our students can feel seen within their environments. It's not as simple as having a one-size-fits-all club, but allowing people to have, maybe this is Kenyan culture, and maybe this is Egyptian culture, not just assuming that having an African culture club would be enough to represent all of the different levels of diversity that make up our school population. Continuing offering opportunities for students to learn about our culture and create a safe place for them to ask questions, share, oh, sorry, that was the same one twice, I apologize. Teach more about every culture. The world is such a different place now, and our children wrestle with so many challenges. I think listening to them and, oh, my little bar is in the way, so I can't see what the rest of that says, but that's another suggestion that came from the survey. And lastly, teach the truth, be a community that the students feel. I wanted this to be the last suggestion that came from the survey, specifically because this lends to what we do at the Institute for Common Power. At the Institute for Common Power, we believe in teaching truth to power, but specifically teaching truth, right? We want everyone to be able to get that information that they may not be able to get in the classroom. And to start with that, let's just take a look at some things that, respectfully, I did not know until I joined this group of educators. And some things that our students may not know because this isn't the truth that we're allowed to present to them. So first thing first, we see over in beginning in 1910, ranging all the way to 1970, we have the intentional movement of more than 6 million Black people from the South to the North, Midwest, and West, also known as the Great Migration or migrations, because it happened 2 critical times that we learned about from Dr. Terry Ann Scott. In 1921, we see the Tulsa Race Massacre occurs in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1949, we get the desegregation of the armed forces, which is so powerful to think of because our Black soldiers were fighting in wars and battles long before 1948, and it was still desegregated. To hear about how they were able to give their lives just as equally as anyone else, but yet their treatment was not the same once they were off of the battlefield, or how they were positioned in places where maybe they weren't as valued as other people, but yet they were still there. They still wanted to fight. They still went through that opportunity. It stands out to me that it wasn't until 1948 that there was an order to desegregate the armed forces. Brown v. Board in 1954, declaring an end to segregation in American public schools. And then lastly, 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, outlawing discriminatory voting tactics like literacy tests and the like. These are all things that our students should know, that they should be aware of, yet these are things that we can barely get to, truths that we can barely address as we still sit in trying to understand what's going on with the mental health of our Black students in our classroom. So what's the solution that we have? What's the solution that we have to be able to address the inequities that exist within our classrooms, and to be able to address the fact that our babies, our students are sitting in classrooms where they often don't necessarily feel seen, or they're not taught their culture, or they're surrounded by a body of people who don't necessarily look like them and can't necessarily tell them everything about their history. We increase student connectedness. We offer them an opportunity to get the services that they need. And I'm going to do a quick little plug with that one and say, we make sure that we fund our schools. This year, our district is learning so much as it pertains to budgets and things that we are no longer able to pay for that a budget before was able to cover. So when we are able to fully fund our schools and make sure that we can give our students everything that they need, one of the beautiful things that our students are able to get are mental health services that they so desperately need and may not be able to otherwise get. Another solution, we engage our community, parents, and guardians. I want to take another moment here just to highlight something that happened just this Friday in one of our schools. In one of our elementary schools within the district, there was a guardian who was picking up a student at an elementary school. And in picking up the student, they also had an infant baby with them, a 9-month-old baby. They left and they ended up coming back to the school because the 9-month baby choked. The 9-month-old baby choked and needed to be resuscitated. They needed CPR. Unfortunately, the guardian called 911, but the guardian did not speak English. Therefore, the 911 operators were not able to help the guardian. The guardian came rushing into the school, and one of the secretaries, was able to perform life-saving CPR on the 9-month-old baby. The baby did live. The baby and the guardian ended up going to the hospital. The older sibling, who was just a 2nd grader, witnessed all of this happening in a matter of moments. So when I say that we need to engage our community, our parents, and our guardians, I mean, that we need to provide services fill in gaps, be a complete wraparound within our neighborhoods so that our families do not miss out on things that will literally save their lives. Being able to offer something as simple as CPR to families so that they can know how to save lives will literally save lives, and that impacts the student that we see in the classroom. And then we must continue to educate to power, teach truth to power, not withhold things because they seem too scary to us, but continue to teach the things that our students need to hear, continue to be the people that our students need in every single capacity of what we do. And when we are able to do that, and the question is asked, and how are the children? Our resounding answer will always be, all the children are well. That is the exact answer that the Maasai tribe gives after they are asked the question, and how are the children? They know the strength of their nation depends on the health of their children. And because they know that their children are healthy, they are able to confidently say, all the children are well. My question to you today is simple. And how are the children? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. I think it is critical for everybody on the call to not just sit with what we have just been given, but to ask that question more often, to ask more people to ask that question more often, and to think about what does it truly mean for students to be sitting in our faces during the day with everything that they are tasked with, and some of the opportunities that might not be afforded to them, and some of the challenges that do actually exist in their lives while they are still trying to be students. I know we all wear many hats and we understand what the real world is to us as adults, but trying to influence a child's mind and shape shift them for the future up against some of the challenges that they have can be quite a tall task. So thank you for that, Michelle. Really powerful, really powerful. Thank you. In the spirit of time, we are being joined by Kanika from South Africa at the moment. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that once you start to present. But Kanika is a professor of English and affiliate faculty in Women and Gender Studies at Texas Tech University. She writes on and teaches feminist and queer studies, globalization, post-colonial, and comparative literature. She's the author of 3 books focusing on literature arising out of feminist, queer, and Black freedom movements. She also teaches undergraduate and graduate courses for students training to be middle and high school English teachers. Currently, she's working on a new book project provisionally titled Black Freedom, From Selma to Soto, Gender Consciousness and Power, focusing on women leadership and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We are more than happy to have you join us, especially in a different time zone, different country. So I'll turn it over to you. Screen looks
Thank you.
good.
Thank you so
Yes,
much,
please.
Luke, for that, Luke and Ivory for the invitation, and Ivory for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Am I audible? I was having some internet issues previously, so just making sure that people can hear me.
Yep,
Thank
we
you
can
so
hear you.
much.
Screen looks good. We can hear you. You're all good to go. All good to go.
Excellent, excellent. Good evening, everyone, or good morning, wherever you're joining us from. I'm very glad to be here for this educators talk. And despite the hitches, I'm thankful for the opportunity and for the organizers to troubleshoot at the last minute and make this possible. Thank you, Luke and Common Power, for the invitation, and also Jessica for generously switching time slots with me. It's 2 a.m. here in South Africa, and I'm spending a few months here thinking, speaking, and writing about the connections between student-led Black freedom efforts in the American South and anti-apartheid resistance by young Black consciousness activists in the 1960s in South Africa, especially the role of women leaders in these movements. My talk today is on the efforts and legacies of women leaders such as Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and Mrs. Amelia Boynton in securing voting rights in Alabama and Mississippi, and the lessons these lives can teach us and the futures that they point towards. Many of our students, of course, do not know about these histories, so it is really important that we learn more about them and we also teach our students about them. So I begin by saying that the legacy of voting rights efforts in the American South is also the story of women leaders from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and many other places across the country. Women in the Black freedom movement were equal participants in the long struggle for enfranchisement. Although women won the right to vote in the 1920s, it would take almost a century before Americans could even consider the possibility of a Black woman serving in the highest office. A long historical view of how we are approaching the 2024 election with an African-American woman presidential candidate can perhaps begin with Mary McLeod Bethune, the founding president of the National Council of Negro Women. Bethune was instrumental in the transition of Black voters from the Republican Party, then known as the Party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party during the Depression. She was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she became the highest-ranking African-American woman in government when President Roosevelt named her Director of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, where she remained from 1936 until 1994. Besides Bethune, this history also includes Septima Clark, who organized a grassroots citizenship education program at the Highlander Folk School. Clark's citizenship schools, combining adult literacy and education, later folded under the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they were models for voter education and freedom school curricula in Mississippi later on. History we have learned about from the previous presenters today. This history also encompasses Septima Clark's good friend and colleague, Ella Baker, who played a key role in founding SNCC as an organization and ensuring that it remained distinct from the more mainstream organizations. In the next 15 minutes or so, I want to establish connections between the past and the present by directing attention to women leaders who deserve special mention when we think of legacies of voting rights in the United States. There are many of these, as you can see from the first slide, but I'm just going to focus on two in the interest of time. Two of these figures are from the past, and towards the end, I'll also mention one from the present. The first is Mrs. Amelia Boynton, who was, as you can see, born in Savannah, Georgia. And when one reads about her life and listens to the interviews and reads transcripts of these interviews, one comes across several anecdotes which kind of reveal how she belonged to a political family and has very clear memories of her mother going around in a horse and buggy to get people to go to the registration office to register to vote in the 1920s. After Mrs. Boynton came to Tuskegee, Alabama in 1930 to study home economics, she was not yet registered as a voter. It was her husband who encouraged her to do so. And she mentions in her autobiography that her husband, Samuel Boynton, was what was then called a voucher, a person who could vouch that he knew the people registering to vote, where they lived, and how they had contributed to the city. So she and her husband were not only battling a system which made it extremely hard for Black people to register by making them fill out lengthy forms and take take exams, but also they were battling illiteracy among the community, where many who wanted to register could not do so because they did not understand the process and the paperwork involved in it. I'm sure this all sounds familiar, as this is still the case in certain states, which have made the process of registering and voting extremely complicated for those with less knowledge of the system, including new voters, recent citizens, the previously incarcerated, the elderly, and the infirm, unable to physically cast their votes in person. So to come back to Mrs. Boynton's life, she lived and worked in Selma for the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a home demonstration agent for Dallas County, educating the community about nutrition, health, farming, food processing, etc. She herself became a voucher when her husband passed away in 1963. And she has a story which she narrates, which I'm not going to read out in the interest of time, but she narrates a story how the registrar then had only an 8th grade education and could not himself read many of the applications people filled in to register. And this same person told an old man who had sort of written something in a shaky handwriting on a form that he had failed. And here you have the old man's response. And it's a powerful response because the man replied to the registrar, Mr. White Man, you can't tell me that I can't register. I'll try anyway. I own 140 acres of land. I've got 10 children, and many of them are in the field. I've got a man who's a preacher and a man who's a teacher. And I took these hands that I have and made crops to put them through school. If I am not worthy of being a registered voter, then God have mercy on this city. So he did fill out the form eventually, although he did not become a registered voter. Now, such were the odds in those days that in 8 years, Mrs. Boynton reports they had less than 25 people who actually managed to succeed becoming registered voters. She talks about SNCC-led mass meetings in Selma under Bernard Lafayette and the police response to these so-called outside agitators. She herself was hit several times while joining these efforts. Despite being brutalized, despite being injured, she persisted. And here she is on the 50th anniversary of the Selma March with President Obama and John Lewis across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. These experiences led Mrs. Boynton to run for Congress in 1964. And here's an article from the Washington Post on the same slide. She was the first African-American woman in Alabama to do so when she contested the Democrat who had been representing Alabama's 4th district since 1951. Now, this article is interesting because even as it describes Mrs. Boynton's candidacy, it mentions that though the population of Dallas County was more than 50% Black, fewer than 2% of Black people of voting age were registered there. And it also goes on to describe the role of students and children in educating people to vote, which surprisingly also caused some very tiny, minuscule changes within the white community, which was previously vehemently and universally opposed to Black enfranchisement. A similar story of fighting against the odds is evident in Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer's life and legacy. She was, as you can see, born to a sharecropper's family. She had a rudimentary education, but it did allow her to become a plantation timekeeper. And she credits her first political awakening to a church meeting where she heard student activists urging Black people to register to vote. Although she was sometimes dismissed as an uneducated vernacular woman by some mainstream leaders, SNCC activists Ella Baker, Bob Moses, and Prathia Hall, and many, many others realized that Mrs. Hammer and others like her had many things to teach them. In her testimony before a panel on Mississippi and civil rights in Washington, D.C., Mrs. Hammer recounts an incident at the plantation where she worked after she attempted to register. When she returned, having traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse to register, she was fired from the plantation where she had worked as a timekeeper and a sharecropper for 18 years. And this is the dialogue between her and the plantation owner that she recounts. Notice her response. She says, I didn't register for you. I tried to register for myself. She was brutalized in a Winona prison while on her way back from a week-long voter education workshop in South Carolina led by Septima Clark, who I previously mentioned. The injuries she suffered then led to permanent damage, though this did not deter her at all from her efforts at voter registration and voter education in the state. As we have heard already from Kamau, she was part of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which issued a challenge to the Mississippi Democrats. And along with the MFDF party members, she went to the Democratic National Convention in 1964, seeking recognition as the official delegation. We know she spoke before the Credentials Committee, and President Lyndon Johnson was so threatened by her testimony that he called an impromptu press conference just to make sure that the television news media would not cover Mrs. Hammer's testimony. Of course, it backfired because they did cover her testimony in the evening news. Like Mrs. Amelia Boynton, her work with voter education energized her to announce her candidacy for the Mississippi House of Representatives in 1964. However, she was barred from the ballot. But just a year later, Mrs. Hammer, Mrs. Victoria Gray, and Mrs. Annie Devine became the first Black women to stand in the U.S. Congress when they unsuccessfully protested the Mississippi House election of 1964. Years of protests finally yielded some results, as in 1968, Mrs. Hammer was a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation. So we can see that without the efforts of these women as bridge leaders in Alabama and Mississippi, neither the SCLC nor SNCC would have been able to gain a foothold in Dallas County or Greenwood. And both Mrs. Boynton and Mrs. Hammer acknowledge the leading role played by student activists in mass mobilization of potential voters. In turn, the students and mainstream civil rights workers recognized that they needed the local knowledge and the homegrown wisdom and the courage of people like Mrs. Hammer and Mrs. Boynton to have access to the local people. Nor were their efforts limited to the states and counties where they worked. The legacies of these efforts were evident all over the nation. So, for instance, the voter mobilization and educator efforts of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was successfully used in the North Carolina Voters Project, as you can see by this booklet on the right, produced to inform people of the process of exercising their right to select their candidates. This was modeled on the MFDP challenge and the booklets produced by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to the left here. But what we see here is the direct impact of education on political leadership by people of color. And this is what some people fear, as we have seen in recent times. So these leaders' trajectories from grassroots voting rights advocates to political candidates themselves, to bring it to the present, are replicated at least partially in the current moment by Georgia's Stacey Abrams, whose nonprofit Fair Fight 2020 is credited with a large boost in Democratic votes in Georgia, and an estimated 800,000 new voter registrations. Abrams is a Mississippi-raised Georgian who rose to become her state legislature's minority leader, and she has connected voter mobilization with her own political aspirations to office in the same tradition that I'm charting today. We all know that she lost the office of Georgia governor to then Secretary of State Brian Kemp by only about 55,000 votes. Her defeat followed persistent complaints about lack of access to voting, particularly among Black voters. Most importantly for me, Abrams has a deep sense of the connections between census counting and local elections, along with an awareness that the United States is not an exception when it comes to threats to democracy seen oftentimes in other parts of the world. We like to believe that if the United States is the bastion and the champion of democracy, there are no threats to democracy within the country, and we know that's not true. Just as there are threats to democracy in recent times in Senegal, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and many other countries around the world, Abrams reminds us repeatedly that we must also be vigilant and be on guard to protect our democracy. State capture, I'm suggesting, is as real here as it is elsewhere in the world. And we need to think of this as we remember and teach about the legacies of Black women's efforts to secure voting rights and of Black women in office in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and hopefully Washington, D.C. in November 2024. Thank you for listening, and any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hey, Kanika, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really incredible work, and I'm excited to see how that kind of pairs with our next presenter who's coming on in a second. But I'm hoping that you can maybe tell us a little bit more about, you've told us about some pretty incredible American women here, and I'd love to hear some more about just some of the connections you've been able to make to the work that you're doing in South Africa. Are you able to speak to that a little bit off the cuff for us?
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, so I have this collection, I can hold it up to you. This is a collection which a local activist brought out a few years ago. It's a collection which is talking about women in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa from the 1960s to the 70s. And very often the movements are characterized by charismatic male leaders, and South Africa was no exception. The charismatic male leaders, we all know them: Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Steve Biko, blah blah blah. Very important figures, really important figures, historic figures. But then also remember that these people were in prison or under banning orders for most of their careers. So who was carrying on the work while these guys were in prison? It was the women who were carrying on the community efforts, the mobilization efforts, the grassroots efforts. So these are some of the connections that I've been able to draw between South Africa and the United States context. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an interesting connection. Yeah, the parallel, like we often think about this American story, but it really is there's a global history that's happening kind of all in that same context around the 50s and 60s. And yeah, and I appreciate you centering women in the retelling of that story in so much of your work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Carmen, can I send it over to you?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much. I actually also really appreciated the centering of women and their contributions and how active they were, just because in our current political climate, it's really empowering to see that this is not just someone is coming and doing this for the first time. Historically, women have been taking control. It's just not the narrative that we've been told. And the more we tell it, the more our students know. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I am going to introduce our next speaker, if she is ready to go. I gave you co-host privileges if you want to start to set up your slides. And we have Jessica Ellison is the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. Prior to this role, she served as a teacher educator at the Minnesota Historical Society for 18 years. She is serving a second term on her local school board and is in her third year as a board chair. Jessica lives in the Twin Cities with her husband and their 4 kids. Jessica, take it away.
All right. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm so thrilled to be here to talk about school boards. Who knew that school boards would be such an important topic? So I'm gonna share my screen here, and I hope that folks will be willing to ask a lot of questions about what we're going to discuss here, because we're just going to roll through some information really quickly so that you can think about how this will apply in your particular situations. So, as was mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. I am at heart a history educator. I've never been in a classroom, but I have spent my entire career learning from teachers and talking to teachers, and teachers are my entire heart. I have also served on my school board since 2018. I ran for the first time in 2017. And then I ran for re-election in 2021, which, as you might recall, was a really tumultuous time. We were still in the middle of COVID. We were making decisions about masks and about virtual learning. And then came in all of the CRT conversation. So it has been a ride, but my most important role in my life, I believe, is the role of mother. So my kids are in 11th, 9th, 8th, and 6th grades. And so, as you might imagine, it's a lot of chaos at our house. But what I'm here today to really talk about is school board history, what school boards do, what school boards don't do, and what you can do, and some reflection, because I think there is a significant misunderstanding in the general public about what is a school board's role, what are the things that school board members can and should be doing, and what they shouldn't be doing. And so I think this knowledge, especially in the moment that we're in, will be tremendously helpful as we look at this incredibly local piece of United States education history. So I'm going to start with a primary source, which is where all good presentations about history should start. And this source, when I first uncovered it, I just couldn't believe that it had the most amazing title I've ever seen. It's called the Old Deluder Satan Act. Like, I cannot make this up. This is what it is called. It was a law written in Massachusetts in the 1640s that called for the creation of schools. And the reason that this law was written was because the people in Massachusetts, the decision makers, didn't want Satan to take hold. They wanted their students, their children, to have access to literacy, in particular, being able to read the Bible and to learn so that that old deluder Satan could not get to them. And so if you think about where not just schools started, but the school board as a governing body began, it really was in Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1640s. And so the Old Deluder Satan Act, which I have linked here too for your reading pleasure, was one of the first to establish a law to require compulsory school. So now at this time, of course, the population of Europeans in North America was relatively small, but they still needed someone to oversee the schools. And so in Boston, the schools were overseen by some local elected officials called selectmen, and they were all men at this time, until specific citizens committees were created in the 1720s. And so before the 1720s, it was simply local elected officials making decisions about funding, making decisions about purchasing books, which were incredibly expensive at the time. And then citizens committees were created to take that burden off of the selectmen. The idea being that these local committees had a specific investment in the local schools that were educating their own children. And then in 1826, Massachusetts enacted a law to require each town, so not just the state as a whole, but each town to choose a committee to be the school governing body separate from the city government. And what this will show us as we go through the history is that school boards have been largely separate from other forms of local government, which is really key as we're thinking about the decisions that school boards are making. So by 1870, all southern states in particular had included in their constitutions a provision for free public schools. This is happening during Reconstruction, as we're talking about educating free Black children and the need to create these free public schools because a lot of the children in the South, especially the wealthy white children, were being educated privately. And so at this time in the 19th century, the local control of schools really flourished because, again, these are your kids attending your local schools, and you want to make the decisions that are right for you. And oftentimes, these local schools would have very little in common with their neighboring schools because a particular town gets to make decisions based on who lives there, and it's going to be different decisions that are made the next town over. By the end of the 19th century, school boards, or whatever they were called, Board of Education, as they were moving away from being called committees and really a governing board, were tasked with all operations and maintenance of schools or districts. And this is a lot of things. This one of the things that I learned as a school board member right away is the intricacies that are involved in running a school district. No matter how big or small your school district is, there are a lot of moving parts, and a lot of it has to do with money. And so at this time, school boards did everything. So hiring and firing of all the staff, deciding on the curricula that was going to be used, levying taxes. The boards really served as all three branches of government. They were the executives, they were the legislature, and they were the judges in making all the decisions. And so you can imagine that a lot of these boards became quickly overwhelmed. There's a lot of day-to-day things that they were having to do. And so with that, in the late 19th and early 20th century, school boards were centralized and modernized. And with that centralization, a lot of districts started bringing in a chief executive who's the superintendent. So that allowed the school boards to take on this more governance role, and then the superintendent is the one making the day-to-day decisions. And as this continued, as things were being centralized and modernized and standardized, that was really important in the early 20th century. We see a lot of consolidation. So if any of you live in rural areas, you might know that your school district has 2 or 3 names attached to it. Like there's a school district in rural Minnesota called Kirkoven, Murdoch, Sunburg. So those were 3 different school districts that were consolidated into one to save money, to save time, to save staffing. And so if you look at these statistics here, in the 1930s, there were almost 120,000 districts in the US. By the late 90s, it was just over 15,000. So it was incredible consolidation, which has its benefits, its drawbacks. You see in rural areas, a lot of students riding school buses for an hour to school and an hour back from school to get to their local buildings. But it also ensures that there's access. The whole idea of at-large board elections also became more common. If you're looking at the number of school board members in the 19th century, sometimes school boards had 50 people, which sounds really stressful to me. We have 7 on my school board, and it's still, it's hard to make decisions sometimes to have 50 people. How did they get anything done? And the elections were really done ward by ward. You'll see a lot of that still happening today, where school boards will elect, they'll have the district divided up into different wards, just like in a city council. But for the most part, school board elections are very much at large. That started in the early 1900s, and that helped to continue to decrease the number of board members. So there was an average of 20, and that quickly decreased to an average of 7, which is about where we're at right now at this moment. So with that consolidation and standardization also came the federal and state governments taking a much bigger role in the funding and legislating of schools. So before this, the funding came largely locally from local taxes, often from local donors, things like that. But then in the 50s, the federal government came in with some money and also said, okay, here's our money. And here's the regulations that we also want to put in place, and that the state governments as well. So that's why you see a lot of mandates coming down from the federal government, from the state governments. And that has continued to increase. And in some cases, especially with state governments, these state mandates are making it difficult in some cases for the school boards to do their work. Here's an example from my own state. So I'm from Minnesota, and last year our state legislature and Governor Tim Walz started a program where every student in Minnesota would get a free breakfast and a free lunch. It's an incredible program. But what that did then for individual school districts is we had to figure out how that was going to work. Because it's not just, it comes down from on high and then magically everybody gets a lunch. It requires a lot more staffing. It requires looking at the food that we bring in. It requires us looking at our finances. So nothing that happens federally and statewide doesn't trickle down into impacting school board work. So with that, school boards mostly have remained independent governmental bodies. They're separate from city councils, they're separate from county boards, but regulations have certainly increased in a lot of ways. With No Child Left Behind, there were a lot of testing requirements, and that certainly does affect school boards' ability to operate independently. But the funding is really critical to this conversation, because we need to think about how school districts are funded. When you've got school districts that are in relatively wealthy communities, those property taxes are going to be so much higher, which it's going to put more money into these schools, which of course increases the number of resources that are available for our students. On the other side of that, if you have school districts that are in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, the opposite is happening. And so the local control of school boards remains, but that they're often beholden to the geography of where they are. So as of 2018, 18% of school districts also have to have their budgets approved by an external body, which is often a city council or a county board. 52% of districts cannot levy taxes. And that is hugely important, because if a school district cannot look at their needs and say, hey, we need to levy some taxes so that we can purchase new musical instruments or new textbooks for our students, if they're not allowed to do that, then that immediately leads to cuts, because they're not getting enough per pupil from their state government. And 21% cannot hold bond elections. So one of the first things I learned when I was a school board member is that B equals bond equals buildings. So bonds, like bond referendums, is when you need to build stuff for your school district. So it's new buildings, it's the roof on your high school, etc. So if you can't hold bond elections and you need to put a new roof for $700,000 on your school, what do you do? So this is all to say that while school boards began locally and are still very much a local institution, now there are so many more external factors leading into the decisions that a school board can make. So really quickly, I wanted to talk about who are the people on school boards. What's interesting is that school boards were one of the very first public elected offices that women successfully achieved. And it was allowed, so to speak, because people figured, well, women are of the home, that's their domain. It's important for them to look out for their children. And so it makes sense for them to serve on school boards. So Marietta Patrick and Lydia Hall may have been the very first public elected officials in this country, and they were elected to their school board in Massachusetts in 1855. And what you see, because of that long history of women in service, this is one of the only, it might be the only governmental bodies in this country that has close to gender parity. If you look at Congress, if you look at judgeships, if you look at city councils, it's nowhere near this type of gender parity. So these are the most recent board demographics. It's 6 years old now. I would be really interested to see what the difference is now. But it's, the board members across the country, 52% male, 46% female, largely skewing white. And that's true across the country. On my own board, we have 7 board members, 6 are women, and 1 is a woman of color. 27% of board members are educators, which I think is really fascinating because it's always been the case that school boards are made up of people from the community. And the hope is that there's different ideas and different experiences to help bring that knowledge to the board. But not all of them have educational knowledge and understanding. And if you're thinking about just even like the acronyms that are present in school district life, there's so many acronyms. And, do people who are not from an educational background know what an IEP is? So that's a really interesting statistic. 11% are business and finance, but what I have learned is that running a school district is incredibly different from running a business. They're just very, very different. 62% of them have a household income over $100,000. So these are people who are in a higher income bracket. 40% are retired and 32% have school-age kids. So what all of this points to is that a lot of the people who serve on school boards have time. They either are retired or their children are grown. They have time to do this service. When I started on the school board, my youngest was 4 years old. And it was a haul, y'all. Like it was a lot. My husband was working nights trying to find somebody to watch the kids so I could go do my school board meeting. I can see why people with young children don't run, but shouldn't those be the people who run? So I wanted to dive really briefly into a couple of cases, some local cases, some Supreme Court cases that are related to school board justice and school board governance, because I think it's easy to kind of look at the school boards as this, these nice little organizations that they're making decisions for their local community. When in reality, these school boards are making hugely impactful decisions for their time and place that lead into or are impacted by other landmark cases. So the first one I wanted to talk about was Roberts versus the City of Boston in 1848. And so Sarah Roberts was a 5-year-old Black child who was required to enroll in a segregated all-Black school. And at the time, it was far from her home. The white school was much closer. So her father challenged the Boston School Committee, the school board, policy citing the Massachusetts Constitution, which says that all people are equal under the law. And so in 1850, the judge, Lemuel Shaw, disagreed. And here's what he said, that racial segregation in schools was permitted because, quote, racial prejudice is not created by law and probably cannot be changed by law. So this is in Massachusetts. And I think as a Northerner, a lot of times we think about these issues of segregation and de jure and de facto as kind of happening elsewhere, which is 100% not true. So this case, which the Roberts family lost, was cited in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. So this is one of the cases that, you know, took place as we're thinking about like separate but equal, and thinking about how people are segregated in different aspects of life that became important in this landmark case. The next one I wanted to talk about was Cumming versus Richmond County Board of Education, which is coming immediately after Plessy. So Roberts happened, then Plessy happened. And so in 1897, the board of Richmond County, Georgia, levied a tax of $45,000 to support the schools, which we do all the time, right? We levy these taxes to, you know, to help improve our schools. So the high school, the singular high school in the county was only open to white children. And money was not adequately allocated to schools for Black children because the county, the school board said, well, we need to spend our money somewhere. So we're going to spend it on this high school, which is only open to white children. But then they didn't take that money and put it into these segregated schools. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court unanimously supported the Richmond County Board of Education. And the decision actually says that there are far more Black children in the county, and the board can afford to provide an education to all. They really were pointing to an economic situation. It went on to say, and this is what I think is really interesting. They said, well, if there had been a request to build a high school for Black children and it was denied based on race, well, then a different decision might have transpired in this case. So they were saying, well, because the Black community was not asking for a high school, which was then subsequently denied by the Board of Education, then this is not racially motivated. So this particular case was overturned by Brown v. Board, but that wasn't for another over 50 years. And the final one I want to talk about, I think, really has reverberations throughout the next 50 years up until the present. It's Green versus the School Board of New Kent County. So this was in Virginia. And this was coming after Brown v. Board, you know, to desegregate with all deliberate speed, et cetera. And after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, school districts had to create a desegregation plan. Otherwise, their funding could be cut if they didn't have a plan. So the New Kent County plan was a freedom of choice plan. So students could choose to attend the mostly white New Kent High School or the all-Black high school, right? And so what happened was 115 Black students chose to attend the mostly white school, and no white students chose to attend Watkins. So think about that for a second. So some of the Black children attended the mostly white high school. It was, you know, a lot likely closer to their home and other various reasons why they chose to attend that school, but not a single white student chose to attend Watkins. So Black parents and the NAACP were saying that this is not effective desegregation, because if it's just a choice that's left up to the parents, there's no deliberate action to desegregate. So they brought the case, U.S. District Court and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled for the district, saying they have a plan. It satisfies the requirements, right? And so the U.S. Supreme Court at this point kind of was fed up with this all deliberate speed, and it overturned the lower court's decisions and said, no, you need a new actual plan to desegregate your schools. And so in thinking about the whole idea of choice and vouchers right now, that's very much a part of our national discourse. This is something that comes back to this Green case, and that does freedom of choice actually lead to integration? So what does all of this history tell us? Well, the history tells us that local public education is baked into our national story from the beginning, that schools are very personal, they're local. We love our teachers, we love the opportunities that our children have, and therefore the people that lead our schools are also a part of that community. And along with that, this oversight of local schools began and has remained largely local, which makes being a school board member a really interesting elected office. I mean, I run into people all the time in my community, and they'll come up to me and they'll say, "Aren't you on the White Bear Lake School Board?" And to which I always go, "Yes," because I'm never sure how they're coming at me with that question. But it's very much of the community. And also that school boards have this power to shape the educational experiences of our children in so many different ways. And if you just look at those three cases, they have not only the power to shape locally, but also statewide and nationally. So what I think is important to have this history in the back of our minds as we're thinking about what we can do in this moment to ensure that there is school board justice in the places where we live is to think about what it is that school boards do and don't do. Okay, so here's the really quick rundown. Here are the things that school boards do. We have one employee. We hire, we fire, we evaluate the superintendent, and that is all. The superintendent is in charge of the day-to-day and the hiring and firing of other people in the district. But that person is the only one that we're in charge of. We set and approve a budget. The largest school district in Minnesota last year had a standoff between their school board members. They had 6 members, so 3 and 3. They were not going to approve a budget until this one group said that their demands were satisfied to remove all of the DEI efforts in the district. And they were saying, we're not going to approve a budget. If a budget's not approved, the school board cannot operate and it shuts down, which means that teacher benefits go away. There's no back after school activities, nothing. It ended up resolving, but it was a little scary for a minute. School boards set a vision for the district and then approve a strategic plan. Again, big picture. And then they also create, update, and approve policies. That's the governing laws of the district are the policies. And so I served on the policy committee for a long time on my school board where they would bring new policies to us every month. We would review them and they would go to the board for approval. So the school board really chooses the district's destination, but then the superintendent and leadership, they choose the path to get there. And it is our job to ask questions, to make sure we're getting updated, but not to interfere. So here's a couple of examples. So we just opened a new high school in my community. It's very exciting. In order to do that, the school board had to approve the creation of a bond referendum in 2019, where we would go to our community and ask for funds to build the things that we needed in the district. That's something that we can do. Start times. We changed start times a couple of years ago because the research shows that high school students should start school later. And so we needed to make that shift for the entire district. This picture over here with kids drinking milk, this is one of my favorite things to share when I was a new school board member and I got up there and I had no idea what I was doing. One board meeting, they came to us with the dairy contract. Like, is this what school boards do? We approve our dairy contract? Well, we go through so much milk in our district, and it's such a huge amount of money that we spend that the board had to make the decision about which vendor we went with. So every year when the dairy contract comes in front of us, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. We approve those types of things. And then finally, the school board policies, as you'll see, this is from my district. This is dress codes. And it's been updated many, many times. And you'll see this as an example of a policy that's been updated in a lot of different school districts as we move away from putting all of the blame and emphasis on female students and really make it more gender neutral. But we revised it as recently as last year. Okay, so here's what we don't do. Here's what school boards don't do. We don't hire, fire, evaluate principals or teachers. So when people go to school board members and say, this teacher is not doing, etc., then the school board's job is to say, please go talk to the principal. Please go talk to the superintendent. That is not our job. We don't choose the textbooks. And this might differ from district to district. I think in a lot of places, depending on what's happening politically, School boards might take this on. You know, we choose the courses, we approve the courses that students are taught, but it's not our job to go and like look at samples of textbooks and say, these are the ones that we think we pick. We don't set the processes for carrying out the policies. So for example, school dress code, we say, okay, here's the dress code, but we're not wandering the halls of the high school saying, oh, they're not following the rules. What are you going to do about it? That's for leadership in those buildings. Similarly, we don't resolve any day-to-day disputes or issues in the school building. So if constituents come to me and say, this is happening in the school, I direct them elsewhere. And then we don't make decisions about small scale spending. You know, if an elementary school needs a new printer, great, not my decision. We set the full budget, they make the decisions. I cannot imagine if it was my job to get involved in the details of all of these different schools, we wouldn't get anything done. So the school board's responsible for governance, but not management. So for example, there's a lot of talk about book banning and censorship. We don't choose the books that the librarians bring into the school. That is the job of these trained professional media specialists. So when these book banning issues come up, and they have come up in front of my school board, and it's, you know, the Minnesota legislature passed a law last year to ban book bans. So that's not an issue for us anymore, but we don't make those decisions. We don't hire and fire teachers. We have nothing to do with that. Whatever happens in the classroom, that's something that's dealt with elsewhere. And even though we approve the dairy contract, we don't make small scale decisions about what's on the menu for lunch, right? That's to the schools. So finally, what can you collectively do, right? How do you engage with your school board in a way that's effective and also follows the law? Number one, you can run for school board. And I mean this very seriously. I say this everywhere I go. I never considered myself to be a person who would run for office. And as a person who's highly anxious and really struggles in situations where I have to ask for money or I have to ask for support, I never thought I would do it. But after the election of 2016, I decided I need to do something. And I know about education. So you can run for school board. There are a lot of resources to help you. You can attend board meetings. They can be tremendously boring. And when they're boring, I love it when they're boring because that means we don't have people screaming at us about masks and calling us Nazis, which happened definitely in my school district and other places. So you can attend. You can share feedback with the entire board. There are different avenues to do that. You can send emails, you can do public comment. You can share feedback with individual board members, but a note of caution, individual board members do not have the power to act on their own. The only power that I have is when I'm up on the dais with the other 6 board members. I can't do anything myself. Now, as board chair, there are a couple of things that I can do that the other board members can't. I can contact our legal counsel, you know, other various things, but ultimately it's not something that I can't make decisions on my own. And you can talk with your neighbors and friends. We have a board election this fall. 3 of our seats are up, not mine. I have 2 more years. And I have conversations all the time with my neighbors. They say, oh, good, Jessica, who's running for school board? And tell me about who the candidates are. And we talk about it. Because a lot of people skip the down ballot races. They don't flip over the ballot. Or they see the school board and they're like, oh, I'm going to vote for the people with the names I like the best. This happens a lot. Please talk to your friends and neighbors. The election that I was in 2021, I ran alongside 3 other women, and we all won. The one board member won by 84 votes. This happens all the time, and that can shift a board, that one seat. So please talk. We need to listen to our community perspectives. Absolutely. We don't make promises, but we need to listen. So here's the women that I ran with in 2021. We ran as a slate, and all of us were elected because our community got behind us and supported us in a number of ways. So even if you don't want to run, you can door knock, you can lit drop, you can phone bank, you can donate, you can talk to your neighbors. Please do so. And then you can speak at public comment. I love this picture of Rosa Parks. She's speaking at a school board meeting. You can talk to the board. Now, it's not a dialogue. You talk, we listen, we go on our way, just like an email, right? But having that public speaking is a really critical and impactful way to get your point across. So I want to make sure that I'm being conscious of our time here. I wanted to give you a couple of hints about how to provide feedback to your school board. There's definitely ways that are more effective than others. So the first thing I would do is say, check your district's website for information on the board and when are its meetings, and what are the policies about feedback. So on our website, I linked to ours just so you could see what it looks like. It says when the board meetings are, where they are. It's going to be live streamed. Here's the whole list of board packets and minutes from all these other, find this information. Do some research on the issue at hand. Like, come in with your own experience, but also make an effort to understand what's been done in the past with the school board. Because if you're coming in to talk about something that we discussed 2 board meetings ago, then that's something that you can go and look up. And then make a decision about the best way to get your feedback to the board. Is it an email that you send? Is it a phone call? I do get phone calls from constituents sometimes. Or is it public comment? Now, public comment can be really sensitive, as we've seen images in the past few years of people screaming and taking over board meetings. I had to shut down a school board meeting in 2021 because people were not following the rules of order. They were yelling, they had signs, which they're not supposed to do. And so I had to pause the meeting, leave the room, cry, gather myself, come back and say, if you're not going to follow the rules, you're not allowed to speak. And that remains as probably the most difficult moment of my time on the school board. We have since changed some of our public comment rules so that we don't film it anymore. They have 3 minutes to speak. They have to send in their request to speak beforehand, all these other things. But public comment can be really effective. It needs to be conducted with dignity and following of the rules. All of our business is done in public. We don't do anything behind closed doors unless it's a specific closed session about labor negotiations, etc. So, but there should be very clear procedures about how our meeting in public can be conducted. So as you're addressing the board, really think about, like, what is my concern? Is it a board level issue? What is this process to share feedback? Follow the process. How do I share my story? Be brief, but also an individual example really is impactful for school board members. And then connect that issue to the wider district. And then encourage your neighbors to do the same. So just a couple of examples. We don't really have time to go into them with details. But again, issues with teachers, this is site-based. Don't go to the board. Courses or curriculum, look up how it works in your district. If your district approves courses, but not curriculum, make sure you know that. And then referenda and levies, definitely. This is something the school board does. If you have opinions about communities' taxes, this is a very appropriate place to share with the board. So I put in some resources here, including this really short video that you can look at on your own time from my district, just really outlining kind of what a governance board does, what are the roles, and then some links and suggestions for looking at the National School Board Association, look at your local association, and then check out your Secretary of State's website. You can look at your ballot and see who's running for school board in your community. If you have, this was so fast, so much information. But if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. This is my work email. This is where we live on the socials. in our website. But I firmly believe that every single one of us, whether we're a teacher or a parent or a community member, we must be as invested in our school board and local elections as we are in our national elections, because they matter for our kids. So I'm happy to open it up for if anybody has any questions about anything. See, there's only a couple minutes left, but happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think I love a presentation where every time I write a question down, now the next slide answers it and I cross one off. So I feel like a lot of people are feeling that energy right now because we're all just like ready. That was so like such a comprehensive way to teach us about school boards. I'm also really happy that we recorded it because I will be showing some people because I think you did a really amazing job. So thank you. In the 2 minutes that we have left, we're just going to plug this really amazing map that Ivory and some really tech savvy people made. If you were like fascinated, just like I was with all of our speakers, they are all educator ambassadors for the Institute of Common Power. On our website, we have this interactive map and you can get to know the ones on this call and so many more across the country. We highly encourage you to take a look and you're going to see some really fascinating work that's happening all across the country.
Absolutely. So to end this on the highest of high notes, we thank everybody for hanging in there with us. Those of you that went on the February Learning Tour, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Us Around became the theme song of our time. And it's one of the songs that, you know, is very near and dear to the Institute. So we appreciate all of what it is that you all endured and hanging in there with us. Please be on the lookout for upcoming emails and events that we are going to be sharing with you all. Please stay engaged. Take all of what you learn about school boards and apply that somehow, some way, because education is at the center of our democratic process. And the more of us that know, the more we can do. So if there are any other questions, feel free to reach out to Luke, Carmen, or I in our emails. We thank you for hanging in there with us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next events.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you all.
Thank you all.
Have a
Thank
good evening,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.